Thank you for joining Wars of the Roses. As we continue with Part 7, Sketch of the Life and Doctrines of Pythagoras, from an exposition of the mysteries or religious dogmas and customs of the ancient Egyptians, Pythagoreans and Druids, also an inquiry into the origin, history and purport of Freemasonry, by John Fellows AM. Chapter 5. A sketch of the life and doctrines of Pythagoras, the founder of the sect of ancient philosophers that bore his name. Also the doctrines and customs of the Druids, the priests of the ancient Britons. Notwithstanding Pythagoras died at least 1500 years before the institution of the Freemason Society, he is hailed by the fraternity as a brother Mason. Both Cross and Webb, in treating of Masonic emblems, among which they include a diagram of the 47th problem of Euclid, hold the following language. This was an invention of our once friend and brother, the great Pythagoras, who in his travels through Asia, Africa and Europe was initiated into several orders of priesthood and raised to the sublime degree of Master Mason. This wise philosopher enriched his mind abundantly in a general knowledge of things, and more especially in geometry or masonry. On this subject he drew out many problems and theorems, etc. The appellation of grandfather of Freemasons would perhaps apply much more appropriately to Pythagoras than that of brother, for he probably was the father of Druidism, and this was the father of the Masonic Society, which it made use of as a mere cloak to cover its religious observances, with no special regard to the improvement of the craft. The idea, however, of a connection between Pythagoras and Masonry must have been handed down in tradition by the old Druidical Masons, which is strong evidence that the secrets and ceremonies of Masonry are derived from the ancient Egyptian mysteries through the Pythagorean school. Upon this supposition, of the truth of which I have no doubt, it becomes important to give some account of this celebrated philosopher whose memory is so deservedly venerated by the Masonic order. The best arranged account of his life and doctrines that I have met with is contained in Rees's Cyclopedia. I therefore make the following abstract from that work. Pythagoras was of Samos, the son of a lapidary and the pupil of Pherecydes, and flourished, says Bale, about 500 years before Christ, in the time of Tarquin, the last king of Rome, and not in Numa's time, as many authors have supposed. Posterity has been very liberal to this philosopher in bestowing upon him such inventions as others had neglected to claim, particularly in music, for there is scarcely any part of it as a science with which he has not been invested by his generous followers in biography. Musical ratios have been assigned to him with the method of determining the gravity or acuteness of sounds by the greater or less degree of velocity in the vibration of strings, the addition of an eighth to the lyre, the harmony of the spheres, Plato, and the Greek musical notation, Boethius. His right indeed to some of these discoveries has been disputed by several authors, who have given them to others with as little reason perhaps as they have been before bestowed upon him. After musical ratios were discovered and reduced to numbers, they were made by Pythagoras and his followers the type of order and proportion in all things. Hence virtue, friendship, good government, celestial motion, the human soul, and God himself were harmony. This discovery gave birth to various species of music, far more strange and inconceivable than chromatic and enharmonic, such as divine music, mundane music, elementary music, and many other divisions and subdivisions, upon which Zarlino, Kircher, and almost all the old writers never failed to expatiate with wonderful complacence. The terms sacred and profane music are still retained, appropriating grave and plaintive tones to the former and gay and lively to the latter. On this account, it is reported that Wesley, the founder of the Methodist sect, declared that the devil should not have all the best tunes, and accordingly, he introduced into his church service the most sprightly airs, which are still in use among his followers, having, it is said, the most happy effect. It is perhaps equally to the credit and advantage of music and philosophy that they have long descended from these heights and taken their proper and separate stations upon earth, that we no longer admit of music that cannot be heard or of philosophy that cannot be understood. Master Thomas Mace, author of a most delectable book called Music's Monument, would have been an excellent Pythagorean, for he maintains that the mystery of the Trinity is perspicuously made plain by the connection of the three harmonical concords, 1:3-5, that music and divinity are nearly allied, and that the contemplation of concord and discord, of the nature of the octave and unison, will so strengthen a man's faith that he shall never after degenerate into that gross sub-bestial sin of atheism. Pythagoras is said by the writers of his life to have regarded music as something celestial and divine, and to have had such an opinion of its power over the human affections that, according to the Egyptian system, he ordered his disciples to be waked every morning and lulled to sleep every night by sweet sounds. He likewise considered it as greatly conducive to health and made use of it in disorders of the body as well as in those of the mind. His biographers pretend to tell us what kind of music he applied upon these occasions. Grave and solemn, we may be certain, and vocal, say they, was preferred to instrumental, and the lyre to the flute, not only for its decency and gravity, but because instruction could be conveyed to the mind by means of articulation in singing, at the same time as the ear was delighted by sweet sounds. In perusing the list of illustrious men who have sprung from the school of Pythagoras, it appears that the love and cultivation of music was so much a part of their discipline that almost every one of them left a treatise behind him upon the subject. The first journey of Pythagoras from the Grecian islands was probably into Egypt, which was celebrated in his time for that kind of wisdom which best suited his genius and temper. In his way thither, Jamblichus asserts that he visited Phoenicia and conversed with the prophets and philosophers that were the successors of Mochus the physiologist. While he was in Egypt, he was introduced by the recommendation of Polycrates, tyrant of Samos, to Amasia, king of Egypt, a distinguished patron of literary men, and thus obtained access to the colleges of the priests. The name tyrant, as at first used, merely designated the chief magistrate of a place. The Greeks, in old time, called the supreme governor of every city a tyrant or king. Having found it difficult to gain this privilege, he performed many severe and troublesome preliminary ceremonies and even submitted to circumcision, a prescribed condition of his admission. He passed 22 years in Egypt, availing himself of all possible means of information with regard to the recondite doctrines of the Egyptian priests, as well as their astronomy and geometry, and Egyptian learning in its most unlimited extent. After his return from Egypt to his native island, he wished to communicate the benefit of his researches and studies to his fellow citizens, and with this view he attempted to institute a school for their instruction in the elements of science, proposing to adopt the Egyptian mode of teaching, and to communicate his doctrines under a symbolical form. But the Samians were either too stupid or too indolent to profit by his instructions. Although he was obliged to relinquish his design, he did not altogether abandon it. In order to engage the attention of his countrymen by some other means, he repaired to Delos, and after presenting an offering of cakes to Apollo, he there received, or pretended to receive, moral dogmas from the priestess, which he afterwards delivered to his disciples under the character of divine precepts. With the same views, he also visited the island of Crete, so celebrated in mythological history, where he was conducted by the Corybantes, or priests of Cybele, into the cave of Mount Ida, in which Jupiter is said to have been buried. Here he conversed with Epimenides, an eminent pretender to prophetic powers, and was by him initiated into the most sacred mysteries of Greece. About the same time he visited Sparta and Elea, and was present during the celebration of the Olympic Games, where he is said to have exhibited a golden thigh to Abaris, in order to convince him that he was Apollo. Besides other places which he visited during his stay in Greece, he repaired to Phlius, where he first assumed the appellation of philosopher. Having thus added to the stores of learning which he had previously accumulated and acquired a kind of authority which was calculated to command respect, he returned to Samos and made a second attempt, more successful than his first, to establish a school of philosophy. In a semicircular kind of building which the Samians had used as a place of resort for public business, he delivered, with an assumed authority of a sacred nature, popular precepts of morality, and he also provided himself with a secret cave into which he retired with his intimate friends and professed disciples, And here he gave his followers daily instructions, accompanied with a considerable parade of mystery in the more abstruse parts of philosophy. His fame and the multitude of his followers increased. What he failed to accomplish by mere force of learning and ability, he effected by concealing his doctrines under the veil of mysterious symbols and issuing forth his precepts as responses from a divine oracle. About the beginning of the 59th Olympiad, Pythagoras, desirous of escaping the tyrannical government exercised in his native island by Silason, the brother of Polycrates, left Samos and, as we have already hinted, passed over into Italy and attempted to establish his school among the colonies of Magna Graecia. It is probable that in order to obtain credit with the populace, he about this time pretended to possess a power of performing miracles and practiced many arts of imposture. The first place at which he arrived in Italy was Crotona, a city in the Bay of Tarentum, the inhabitants of which were very corrupt in their manners. But such were his reputation and influence that he was treated with great respect, and people of all classes assembled to hear his discourses, insomuch that the manners of the citizens were soon totally changed from great luxury and licentiousness to strict sobriety and frugality. It is said that 600, some say 2,000 persons were prevailed upon to submit to the strict discipline which he required and to throw their effects into a common stock for the benefit of the whole fraternity. The influence of his philosophy extended from Crotona to many other cities of Magna Graecia, and obtained for Pythagoras from his followers a degree of respect little short of adoration. If he had contented himself with delivering doctrines of philosophy and precepts of practical wisdom, he might probably have continued his labors without molestation to the end of his life. But he manifested a strong propensity towards political innovations, and he employed his influence in urging the people to the strenuous assertion of their rights against the encroachment of their tyrannical governors. This course of conduct raised against him a very powerful opposition which he was unable to resist and contend against, and which obliged him to retire to Metapontum. Here he found himself still surrounded with enemies, and was under a necessity of seeking an asylum in the Temple of the Muses, where, not being supplied by his friends with sufficient food, he perished with hunger. Anobius affirms that Pythagoras was buried alive in a temple. Others state that he was slain in attempting to make his escape. It can hardly be doubted that his death was violent, and that, with all his caution to preserve himself, he fell a martyr to his generous efforts to undeceive mankind. An ill construction was put upon the union of the Pythagoreans, and it proved very fatal to them. That society of students being looked upon as a faction which conspired against the state, 60 of them were destroyed and the rest went into banishment. Diegesis by the Reverend R. Taylor. The time of his death is uncertain, but according to the Chronicon of Eusebius, he died in the 3rd year of the 68th Olympiad, BC 506, after having lived, according to the most probable statement of his birth, to the age of 80 years. After his death, his followers paid a superstitious respect to his memory. They erected statues in honor of him, converted his house at Crotona into a temple of Ceres. The street in which it stood was called the Museum, and appealed to him as a divinity, swearing by his name. It appears from the history of this philosopher that with all his talents and learning, he owed much of his celebrity and authority to imposture. His whole manner of life confirms this opinion. Clothed in a long white robe with a flowing beard and, as some say, with a golden crown on his head, he preserved among the people and in the presence of his disciples a commanding gravity and majesty of aspect. He recurred to music for promoting the tranquility of his mind, frequently singing for this purpose hymns of Thales, Hesiod, and Homer. He had such an entire command over himself that he was never seen to express in his countenance grief, joy, or anger. He refrained from animal food and confined himself to a frugal vegetable diet, excluding from his simple bill of fare, for mystical reasons, pulse or beans. By this artificial demeanor, Pythagoras appeared among the vulgar as a being of an order superior to the common condition of humanity, and persuaded them that he had received his doctrine from heaven. Pythagoras married Theano of Crotona, or, as some say, of Crete, by whom he had 2 sons, Telegus and Nisaeus, who, after his death, took the charge of his school. Whether this philosopher left behind him any writings has been a subject of dispute. Many works have been enumerated under his name by Laertius, Jamblichus, and Pliny, but it is the declared opinion of Plutarch, Josephus, Lucian, and others that there were no genuine works of Pythagoras extant, and it appears highly probable, from the pains which he took to confine his doctrine to his own school during his life, that he never committed his philosophical system to writing, and that the pieces to which his name was affixed at an early period were written by some of his followers upon the principles imbibed in his school. The famous golden verses, attributed to Pythagoras and illustrated with a commentary by Heracles, were not written by our philosopher, but are to be ascribed to Epicharmus or Empedocles. They may, however, be considered as a brief summary of his popular doctrines. His method of instruction, formed upon the Egyptian model, was exoteric and esoteric, that is, public and private. Those auditors who attended his public lectures did not properly belong to his school, but followed their usual mode of living. His select disciples, called his companions and friends, were such as submitted to a peculiar plan of discipline, and were admitted by a long course of instruction into all the mysteries of his esoteric doctrine. Masons, who have taken only the 3 first degrees of the order, are taught only what may be called the exoteric doctrine of Masonry, and this in an obscure symbolical manner not intended to be fully understood. In this grade, they call each other brother. They were formerly, that is, in the time of the Druids, not permitted to advance further until they had convinced their superiors that confidence might be placed in them and that they were worthy of receiving the esoteric principles of the order. When raised to the sublime degree of royal arch, they address one another by the appellation of companion. And then, no doubt in ancient times, the whole secret of Masonry, that is, the doctrine of Druidism, was clearly exposed. Dermot, after making some remarks on the conduct of certain persons, who it seems were dissatisfied at not having been admitted to the Royal Arch degree, says, "To this I will add the opinion our worshipful brother, Dr. Fifield d'Assigné, printed in the year 1744. Some of the fraternity, says he, have expressed an uneasiness at this matter's being kept a secret from them, since they had already passed through the usual degrees of probation, but I cannot help being of opinion that they have no right to any such benefit until they make a proper application and are received with due formality. And as it is an organized body of men who have passed the chair and given undeniable proofs of their skill in architecture, it cannot be treated with too much reverence." Now, Dr. Fifield must have been sensible that architecture was not taught in the lodge in his day. This ridiculous parade, therefore, about skill in this art is a mere excuse for the observance of an ancient custom, the reason for which was unknown. Previously to the admission of any person into this fraternity, Pythagoras examined his features and external appearance, inquired how he had been accustomed to behave towards his parents and friends, marked his manner of laughing, conversing, and keeping silence, and observed what passions he was most inclined to indulge, with what kind of company he chose to associate, how he passed his leisure moments, and what incidents appeared to excite in him the strongest emotions of joy or sorrow. Nor after this examination was anyone admitted into his society, till he was fully persuaded of the docility of his disposition, the gentleness of his manners, his power of retaining in silence what he was taught, and, in fine, his capacity of becoming a true philosopher. After the first probationary admission, the fortitude and self-command of the candidate were put to the trial by a long course of severe abstinence and rigorous exercise. The course of abstinence and self-denial comprehended food and drink and clothing, all of which were of the most plain and simple kind, and the exercises prescribed were such as could not be performed without pain and fatigue. To teach them humility and industry, he exposed them for 3 years to a continued course of contradiction, ridicule, and contempt among their fellows. This is imitated in the past master's degree of Masonry. The newly initiated member, perfectly ignorant of the mode of proceedings in a lodge, is, against his will, placed in the chair of the master as a presiding officer, and the installed worshipful is made the butt for every worthy brother to exercise his wit upon. This custom, it would appear, has descended from the Druids, the ancient schoolmasters of England, to the universities and colleges, even of America, where those of the freshman or newly entered class are made the butt and ridicule of the higher classes for 12 months. The latter are empowered to direct the former to perform any errand they wish, can order them to repair to their rooms, and there lecture them for their awkwardness, ignorance, etc. This practice was doubtless introduced upon the principles of Pythagoras to inculcate humility. But when exercised upon a raw, diffident country boy, it must prove extremely discouraging and oppressive. The custom, however, it is said, has gone into disuse. General Erastus Root of Delhi, in this state, by a resolute refusal to submit to this discipline, has the honor, as I am informed by a graduate of Dartmouth College, of putting an end to this vile practice in that institution. In order to restrain the powerful passion of avarice, he required his disciples to submit to voluntary poverty. He deprived them of all command over their own property by casting the possessions of each individual into a common stock to be distributed by proper officers as occasion required. After this sequestration of their goods, they lived together on a footing of perfect equality, and sat down together daily at a common table. If anyone afterwards repented of the connection, he was at liberty to depart and might reclaim from the general fund his whole contribution. That his disciples might acquire a habit of entire docility, Pythagoras enjoined upon them from their first admission a long term of silence called echesaithia. This initiatory silence, which probably consisted in refraining from speech, not only during the hours of instruction but through the whole term of initiation, continued from 2 to 5 years, according to the propensity discovered by the pupil towards conceit and loquacity. With regard to himself, this was a judicious expedient, as it checked impertinent curiosity and prevented every inconvenience of contradiction. Accordingly, his disciples silenced all doubts and refuted all objections by appealing to his authority. Utos epilta IPN dixit, he decided every dispute. Moreover, during the years of initiation, the disciples were prohibited from seeing their master or hearing his lectures except from behind a curtain, or from receiving instructions from some inferior preceptor. There is an affectation of this sort, as before observed, in the Masonic degrees of Knight of the Eagle and Knight of Kadosh, in which the candidate is not permitted to see the person who initiates him. To the members of the esoteric school, who were called Gesioi, the genuine disciples, belonged the peculiar privilege of receiving a full explanation of the whole doctrine of Pythagoras, which was delivered to others in brief precepts and dogmas under the concealment of symbols. Disciples of this class were permitted to take minutes of their master's lectures in writing, as well as to propose questions and offer remarks upon every subject of discourse. These were particularly distinguished by the appellation of the Pythagoreans. They were also called mathematicians, from the studies upon which they entered immediately after their initiation. After having made sufficient progress in geometrical science, they proceeded to the study of nature, the investigation of primary principles, and the knowledge of God. Those who pursued these sublime speculations were called theorists, and those who devoted themselves more particularly to theology were styled sebetatikoin, religious. Others, according to their abilities and inclinations, were engaged in the study of morals, economics, and policy, and were afterwards employed in managing the affairs of the fraternity, or sent into the cities of Greece to instruct them in the principles of government, or assist them in the institution of laws. The brethren of the Pythagorean college at Crotona, called Coniobion or Coenobium, about 600 in number, lived together as in one family with their wives and children, and the whole business of the society was conducted with the most perfect regularity. Every day commenced with a deliberation upon the manner in which it should be spent, and concluded with a retrospect of the events which had occurred, and of the business that had been transacted. They rose before the sun that they might do him homage. After which they repeated select verses from Homer and other poets, and made use of music, both vocal and instrumental, to enliven their spirits and fit them for the business of the day. They then employed several hours in the study of science. These were succeeded by an interval of leisure, commonly spent in a solitary walk for the purpose of contemplation. The next portion of the day was allotted to conversation. The hour immediately before dinner was filled with various kinds of athletic exercises. Their dinner consisted chiefly of bread, honey, and water, for after they were perfectly initiated, they wholly denied themselves the use of wine. The remainder of the day was devoted to civil and domestic affairs, conversation, bathing, and religious ceremonies. The exoteric disciples of Pythagoras were taught after the Egyptian manner by images and symbols, obscure and almost unintelligible to those who were not initiated into the mysteries of the school. And those who were admitted to this privilege were under the strictest obligation of silence with regard to the recondite doctrines of their master. The wisdom of Pythagoras, that it might not pass into the ears of the vulgar, was committed chiefly to memory, and when they found it necessary to make use of writing, they took care not to suffer their minutes to pass beyond the limits of the school. The principal and most efficacious of their doctrines, the Pythagoreans committed to memory and communicated them to their successors as mysteries from the gods. And if at any time there were any extraneous, or as I may say, profane persons among them, they signified their meaning by symbols. Hence Lysis, reproving Hipparchus for communicating the discourse to uninitiated persons, void of mathematics and theory, saith, "It is reported that you teach philosophy in public to all that come, which Pythagoras would not do. If you are changed, I shall rejoice. If not, you are dead to me. For we ought to remember that it is impious, according to the direction of divine and human exhortations, that the goods of wisdom ought not to be communicated to those whose soul is not purified so much as in dream. It is not lawful to bestow on everyone that which was acquired with so much labor, nor to reveal the mysteries of the Eleusinian goddess to profane persons. They who do both these are alike unjust and irreligious. It is good to consider within ourselves how much time was employed in taking away the spots that were in our breasts, that after 5 years we might be made capable of his Pythagoras's discourses." Jamblichus, quoted in T. Stanley's History of Philosophy, London, 1666, page 376. Clemens observes that the two orders above described corresponded very exactly to those among the Hebrews. For in the schools of the prophets there were two classes, viz., the sons of the prophets, who were the scholars, and the doctors or masters, who were also called perfecti. And among the Levites, the novices or tyros, who had their quinquennial exercises by way of preparation. Lastly, even among the proselytes there were two orders, exoterici, or proselytes of the gate, and intrinseci, or perfecti, proselytes of the covenant. He adds it is highly probable that Pythagoras himself had been a proselyte of the gate, if not of the covenant. After the dissolution of the assembly of Pythagoras' disciples by the faction of Chilo, a man of wealth and distinction at Crotona, it was thought necessary by Lysis and Archippus, in order to preserve the Pythagorean doctrine from oblivion, to reduce it to a systematic summary, at the same time, however, strongly enjoining their children to preserve these memoirs secret and to transmit them in confidence to their posterity. From this time, books began to multiply among the followers of Pythagoras, till at length, in the time of Plato, Philolaus exposed the Pythagorean records to sale, and Archytas of Tarentum gave Plato a copy of his commentaries upon the aphorisms and precepts of his master. Of the imperfect records of the Pythagorean philosophy left by Lysis, Archytas, and others, nothing has escaped the wreck of time, except perhaps sundry fragments collected by the diligence of Stobaeus, concerning the authenticity of which there are some grounds for suspicion, and which, if admitted as genuine, will only exhibit an imperfect view of the moral and political doctrine of Pythagoras under the disguise of symbolical and enigmatical language. The strict injunction of secrecy, which was given by oath to the initiated Pythagoreans, has effectually prevented any original records of their doctrine concerning nature and God from passing down to posterity. On this head we are to rely entirely for information, and indeed concerning the whole doctrine of Pythagoras, upon Plato and his followers. Plato himself, while he enriched his system with stores from the magazine of Pythagoras, accommodated the Pythagorean doctrines, as he also did those of his master Socrates, to his own system, and thus gave an imperfect and, we may suppose, in many particulars, a false representation of the doctrines of the Samian philosopher. It was farther corrupted by the followers of Plato, even in the Old Academy and afterwards in the Alexandrian school. To which we may add that the doctrine of Pythagoras itself, probably in its original state and certainly in every form under which it has been transmitted to us, was observed not only by symbolical but by mathematical language, which is rather adapted to perplex than to illustrate metaphysical conceptions. In this fault, Pythagoras was afterwards imitated by Plato, Aristotle, and others. Moderatus saith that the Pythagoric philosophy came at last to be extinguished, first because it was enigmatical, next because the writings were in the Doric dialect, which is obscure, by which means the doctrines delivered in it were not understood, and moreover because they who published them were not Pythagoreans. Besides, Plato, Aristotle, and others, as the Pythagoreans affirm, vended the best of them as their own, changing only some few things in them. But the more vulgar and trivial and whatsoever was afterwards invented by envious and calumnious persons to cast a contempt upon the Pythagorean school, they collected and delivered as proper to that sect. Porphyry, page 36, Stanley, page 363. We extract from Brooker the following faint delineation of the Pythagorean philosophy. The end of philosophy is to free the mind from those encumbrances which hinder its progress towards perfection, and to raise it to the contemplation of immutable truth and the knowledge of divine and spiritual objects. This effect must be produced by easy steps, lest the mind, hitherto conversant only with sensible things, should revolt at the change. The first step towards wisdom is the study of mathematics, a science which contemplates objects that lie in the middle way between corporeal and incorporeal beings, and as it were on the confines of both, and which most advantageously inures the mind to contemplation. The monad, or unity, is that quantity which, being deprived of all number, remains fixed, whence called monad from to menein, to remain. It is the fountain of all number. The duad is imperfect and passive, and the cause of increase and division. The triad, composed of the monad and duad, partakes of the nature of both. The tetrad tetractys, or quaternion number, is the most perfect. The decad, which is the sum of the four former, comprehends all arithmetical and musical proportions. According to some writers, the monad denotes the active principle in nature, or God, the duad, the passive principle, or matter. The triad, the word formed by the union of the two former, and the tetractys, the perfection of nature. Some have understood by this mysterious number the four elements, others the four faculties of the human mind, others the four cardinal virtues, and others have been so absurd as to suppose that Pythagoras made use of this number to express the name of God, in reference to the word Jehovah, by which that name is expressed in the Hebrew language. But every attempt to unfold this mystery has hitherto been unsuccessful. Next to numbers, music had the chief place in the preparatory exercises of the Pythagorean school, by means of which the mind was to be raised above the dominion of the passions and initiated to contemplation. Pythagoras considered music not only as an art to be judged of by the ear, but as a science to be reduced to mathematical principles and proportions. It was said of Pythagoras by his followers, who hesitated at no assertion, however improbable, which might seem to exalt their master's fame, that he was the only mortal so far favored by the gods as to be permitted to hear the celestial music of the spheres. Pythagoras applied music to the cure of diseases both bodily and mental. It was, as we have seen, the custom of his school to compose their minds for rest in the evening, and to prepare themselves for action in the morning by suitable airs, which they performed upon the lute or other stringed instruments. The music was, however, always accompanied with verse, so that it may be doubted whether the effect was to be ascribed more to the musician or to the poet. It is said of Clinias, a Pythagorean, that whenever he perceived himself inclined to anger, spleen, or other restless passions, he took up his lute, and that it never failed to restore the tranquility of his mind. Pythagoras himself, it is related that he checked a young man who in the midst of his revels was meditating some act of bacchanalian madness, by ordering the musician, who had inflamed his passions by Phrygian airs, to change the music on a sudden into the slow and solemn Doric mood. If the stories which are related by the ancients concerning the wonderful effects of their music are to be credited, we must acknowledge we are strangers to the method by which these effects were produced. Besides arithmetic and music, Pythagoras cultivated geometry, which he had learned in Egypt, but he greatly improved it by investigating many new theorems and by digesting its principles in an order more perfectly systematical than had before been done. Several Greeks about the time of Pythagoras applied themselves to mathematical learning, particularly Thales in Ionia, but Pythagoras seems to have done more than any other philosopher of this period towards reducing geometry to a regular science. His definition of a point is a monad, or unity with position. He taught that a geometrical point corresponds to unity in arithmetic, a line to 2, a superficies to 3, a solid to 4. Of the geometrical theorems ascribed to Pythagoras, the following are the principle: that the interior angles of every triangle are together equal to 2 right angles, that the only polygons which fill up the whole space about a given point are the equilateral triangle, the square, and the hexagon, the first to be taken 6 times, the second 4 times, and the third 3 times, and that in rectangular triangles the square of the side which subtends the right angle is equal to the 2 squares of the sides which contain the right angle. Upon the invention of this later proposition, Plutarch says that Pythagoras offered an ox, others a hecatomb, to the gods. But this story is thought by Cicero inconsistent with the institutions of Pythagoras, which, as he supposes, did not admit of animal sacrifices. Theoretical philosophy, which treats of nature and its origin, was the highest object of study of the Pythagorean school, and included all those profound mysteries which those who have been ambitious to report what Pythagoras said behind the curtain have endeavored to unfold. Upon this subject, nothing can be advanced with certainty, especially respecting theology, the doctrine of which Pythagoras, after the manner of the Egyptian priests, was peculiarly careful to hide under the veil of symbols, probably through fear of disturbing the popular superstitions. The ancients have not, however, left us without some grounds of conjecture. With respect to God, Pythagoras appears to have taught that he is the universal mind, diffused through all things, the source of all animal life, the proper and intrinsic cause of all motion, in substance similar to light, in nature like truth, the first principle of the universe, incapable of pain, invisible, incorruptible, and only to be comprehended by the mind. The region of the air was supposed by the Pythagoreans to be full of spirits, demons, or heroes, who cause sickness or health to man or beast and communicate at their pleasure, by means of dreams and other instruments of divination, the knowledge of future events. That Pythagoras himself held this opinion cannot be doubted if it be true, as his biographers relate, that he professed to cure diseases by incantations. It is probable that he derived it from the Egyptians, among whom it was believed that many diseases were caused by demoniacal possession. The doctrine of the Pythagoreans respecting the nature of brute animals and metempsychosis, the transmigration of souls, were the foundation of their abstinence from animal food, and of the exclusion of animal sacrifices from their religious ceremonies. This doctrine Pythagoras probably learned in Egypt, where it was commonly taught. Nor is there any sufficient reason for understanding it, as some have done symbolically. The precept prohibiting the use of beans is one of the mysteries which the ancient Pythagoreans never disclosed, and which modern ingenuity has in vain attempted to discover. Pythagorean precepts of more value are such as these: discourse not of Pythagorean doctrines without light. Above all things, govern your tongue. Quit not your station without the command of your general. Remember that the paths of virtue and of vice resemble the letter Y. To this symbol Persius refers when he says, "There has the Samian wise instructive make, pointed the road thy doubtful foot should take. There warned thy raw and yet unpracticed youth to tread the rising right-hand path of truth." After the death of Pythagoras, the care and education of his children and the charge of his school devolved upon Aristaeus of Crotona, who, having taught the doctrine of Pythagoras 39 years, was succeeded by Menisarchus, the son of Pythagoras. Pythagorean schools were afterwards conducted in Heraclea by Clinias and Philolaus, at Metapontum by Theorides and Eurytus, and at Tarentum by Archytas, who is said to have been the 8th in succession from Pythagoras. The first person who divulged the Pythagorean doctrine was Philolaus. The symbolical use of the letter Y has reference to the old fable, before noticed, of the trivia or triple path, that is, where the road to the infernal regions divides into two, the one leading to Elysium and the other to Tartarus. This letter was a very appropriate symbol to mark out these roads, the disproportion of the two strokes which form it being indicative of the comparative numbers to be accommodated in the two courses, that is, of the righteous and the wicked. St. Matthew, no doubt, makes allusion to the common idea entertained upon this subject when he says, "Enter ye in at the strait gate, for wide is the gate, and broad is the way that leadeth to destruction, and many there be which go in thereat. Because strait is the gate, and narrow is the way which leadeth unto life, and few there be that find it." Matthew 7:13. It is surprising, says Bale, that a philosopher so skillful as Pythagoras in astronomy, in geometry, and in other parts of the mathematics should be pleased to deliver his most beautiful precepts under the veil of enigmas. This veil was so thick that the interpreters have found in it ample matter for conjecture. This symbolic method was very much used in the East and in Egypt. It is from thence, without doubt, Pythagoras has derived it. He returned from his travels laden with the spoils of the erudition of all the countries he had visited. It is pretended that his tetractys is the same thing as the name tetragrammaton, a name ineffable and full of mystery according to the rabbins. Others will have it that this tetractys, this grand object of veneration and of oaths, is nothing more than a mysterious manner of dogmatizing by numbers. But let us not forget that Pythagoras and his successors had two ways of teaching, one for the initiated and the other for strangers and the profane. The first was clear and unveiled, the second was symbolic and enigmatical. It is somewhat remarkable that a difference of opinion should exist among the learned in regard to the meaning which Pythagoras intended to convey to his pupils of the esoteric class by the word tetractys, for it appears pretty evident that he used it enigmatically as synonymous with geometry, and so Bailey, who seems to have known more of antiquity than any other of his day, defines it. He says, tetractys in ancient geometry signified a point, a line, a surface, and a solid. Hutchinson, in his Spirits of Masonry, gives the same definition. He says, the Pythagoric tetractys. Tetractys were a point, etc., as above. The ancient Druidical Freemasons were taught, as reported by Pritchard, that there are 4 principles in Masonry which are specified agreeably to the above definition of tetractys. These 4 principles contained in the tetractys or geometry comprehend the entire of physical nature, and on this account the enigma of the perfection of the number 4 has been erected. A writer on Masonry observes that the Pythagoreans affirmed the tetractys or number 4 to be the sum and completion of all things as comprising the 4 great principles both of arithmetic and geometry. In the center of a Masonic lodge within an irradiation or blazing star is inscribed the letter G, denoting the great and glorious science of geometry as cultivated by our ancient and venerable masters, and adds, whilst each of those our symbols reciprocally serves to illustrate the rest, there is one sense in which they yield to the decided preeminence of the great central emblem, whose sacred initial character, surrounded by a blaze of glory, recalls our minds from the work to the architect, from the science to its mystery. The Egyptians invented geometry, and they found it of such infinite importance that they, in a manner, deified the science, hence the great respect paid to it in Masonry. It is in fact made to indicate the Supreme Being who, according to the Pythagorean doctrine, was mysteriously involved in the physical principles of nature. Geometry is painted as a lady with a sallow face, clad in a green mantle fringed with silver and holding a silver wand, the nalometer, in her right hand. Bailey. The Eleusinian mysteries were regularly celebrated every 4 years, that is, after a revolution of 4 years. The Olympic Games took place at the same time, the name of which originated from their being first celebrated near the city of Olympia. Hence the Olympiad, an epoch of 4 years, all arising evidently from the perfection attributed to the number 4. The customs and religious dogmas of the Druids of England, extracted from the History of Great Britain by Robert Henry, D.D. When the Romans first invaded Britain under Julius Caesar, the inhabitants of it were famous, even among foreign nations, for their superior knowledge of the principles and the great zeal for the rites of their religion. To say nothing here of the profits which the Druids derived from the administration of justice, the practice of physic, and teaching the sciences, which were all in their hands. They certainly received great emoluments from those whom they instructed in the principles and initiated into the mysteries of their theology, especially from such of them as were of high rank and came from foreign countries. Nothing can be affirmed with certainty concerning the precise number of the British Druids, though in general we have reason to believe that they were very numerous. Both the Gauls and the Britons of these times were much addicted to superstition, and among a superstitious people there will always be many priests. Besides this, they entertained an opinion, as we are told by Strabo, which was highly favorable to the increase of the priestly order. They were fully persuaded that the greater number of Druids they had in their country, they would obtain the more plentiful harvest and the greater abundance of all things. Nay, we are directly informed by Caesar that great numbers of people, allured by the honors and privileges which they enjoyed, embraced the discipline of the Druids of their own accord, and that many more were dedicated to it by their parents. Upon the whole, therefore, we shall probably not be very much mistaken if we suppose that the British Druids bore as great a proportion in number to the rest of the people as the clergy in popish countries bear to the laity in the present age. The Druids, as well as the gymnosophists of India, the Magi of Persia, the Chaldeans of Assyria, and all the other priests of antiquity, had two sets of religious doctrines and opinions which were very different from one another. The one of these systems they communicated only to the initiated who were admitted into their own order, and at their admission were solemnly sworn to keep that system of doctrines a profound secret from all the rest of mankind. Besides this, they took several other precautions to prevent these secret doctrines from transpiring. They taught their disciples, as we are told by Meller, in the most private places, such as caves of the earth, or the deepest recesses of the thickest forests, that they might not be overheard by any who were not initiated. They never committed any of these doctrines to writing for fear they should thereby become public. Nay, so jealous were some orders of these ancient priests on this head that they made it an inviolable rule never to communicate any of these secret doctrines to women, lest they should blab them. The other system of religious doctrines and opinions was made public, being adapted to the capacities and superstitious humors of the people, and calculated to promote the honor and opulence of the priesthood. It cannot be expected that we should be able to give a minute detail of the secret doctrines of the Druids. The Greeks and Roman writers, from whom alone we can receive information, were not perfectly acquainted with them, and therefore they have left us only some general hints and probable conjectures about them, with which we must be contented. The secret doctrines of our Druids were much the same with those of the gymnosophists and Brahmins of India, the Magi of Persia, the Chaldeans of Assyria, the priests of Egypt, and of all the other priests of antiquity. All these are frequently joined together by ancient authors as entertaining the same opinions in religion and philosophy, which might be easily confirmed by an induction of particulars. The truth is, there is hardly anything more surprising in the history of mankind than the similitude, or rather identity, of the opinions, institutions, and manners of all these orders of ancient priests, though they lived under such different climates, and at so great a distance from one another without intercourse or communication. This amounts to a demonstration that all these opinions and institutions flowed originally from one fountain. The secret doctrines of the Druids and of all these different orders of priests were more agreeable to primitive tradition and right reason than their public doctrines, as they were not under any temptation in their private schools to conceal or disguise the truth. It is not improbable that they still retained in secret the great doctrine of one God, the creator and governor of the universe. This, which was originally the belief of all the orders of priests which we have mentioned, was retained by some of them long after the period we are now considering. That is, from the first invasion of England by the Romans under Julius Caesar, 55 years before the Christian era, to the arrival of the Saxons, AD 449, and might therefore be known to the Druids at this period. This is one of the doctrines which the Brahmins of India are sworn to keep secret, that there is one God, the creator of heaven and earth. Caesar acquaints us that they taught their disciples many things about the nature and perfections of God. Some writers are of opinion and have taken much learned pains to prove that our Druids, as well as the other orders of ancient priests, taught their disciples many things concerning the creation of the world, the formation of man, his primitive innocence and felicity, and his fall into guilt and misery, the creation of angels, their rebellion and expulsion out of heaven, the universal deluge, and the final destruction of this world by fire, and that their doctrines on all these subjects were not very different from those which are contained in the writings of Moses and other parts of Scripture. There is abundant evidence that the Druids taught the doctrine of the immortality of the souls of men, and Mella tells us that this was one of their doctrines which they were permitted to publish for political rather than religious reasons. There is one thing which they teach their disciples which hath been made known to the common people in order to render them more brave and fearless, viz., that souls are immortal and that there is another life after the present. Caesar and Diodorus say that the Druids taught the Pythagorean doctrine of the transmigration of souls into other bodies. This was perhaps their public doctrine on this subject, as being most level to the gross conceptions of the vulgar, but others represent them as teaching that the soul after death ascended into some higher orb and enjoyed a more sublime felicity. This was probably their private doctrine and real sentiments. Man is placed, according to the Druids' doctrine, says Dr. Lingard in his History of England, in the circle of certitude. Good and evil are placed before him for his selection. If he prefer the former, death transmits him from the earth into the circle of felicity. But if he prefer the latter, death returns him to the circle of courses. He is made to do penance for a time in the body of a beast or reptile, and then permitted to reassume the form of man. According to the predominance of vice or virtue in his disposition, a repetition of his probation may be necessary. But after a certain number of transmigrations, his offenses will be expiated, his passions subdued, and the circle of felicity will receive him among its inhabitants. But however agreeable to truth and reason the secret doctrines of the Druids might be, they were of no benefit to the bulk of mankind from whom they were carefully concealed. For these artful priests, for their own mercenary ends, had embraced a maxim which hath unhappily survived them, that ignorance was the mother of devotion, and that the common people were incapable of comprehending rational principles, or of being influenced by rational motives, and that they were therefore to be fed with the coarser food of superstitious fables. This is the reason assigned by Strabo for the fabulous theology of the ancients. It is not possible to bring women and the common herd of mankind to religion, piety, and virtue by the pure and simple dictates of reason. It is necessary to call in the aids of superstition, which must be nourished by fables and portents of various kinds. With this view, therefore, were all the fables of ancient theology invented, to awaken superstitious terrors in the minds of the ignorant multitude. As the Druids had the same ends in view with the other priests of antiquity, it is highly probable that their public theology was of the same complexion with theirs, consisting of 1,000 mythological fables concerning the genealogies, attributes, offices, and actions of their gods, the various superstitious methods of appeasing their anger, gaining their favor, and discovering their will. This farrago of fables was couched in verse, full of figures and metaphors, and was delivered by the Druids from little eminence, of which there are many still remaining, to the surrounding multitudes. With this fabulous divinity, these declaimers intermixed moral precepts for the regulation of the lives and manners of their hearers, and were peculiarly warm in exhorting them to abstain from doing any hurt or injury to one another, and to fight valiantly in defense of their country. These pathetic declamations are said to have made great impression on the minds of the people, inspiring them with a supreme veneration for their gods, an ardent love to their country, an undaunted courage and sovereign contempt of death. The secret and public theology of the Druids, together with their system of morals and philosophy, had swelled to such an enormous size in the beginning of this period that their disciples employed no less than 20 years in making themselves masters of all their different branches, and in getting by heart that infinite multitude of verses in which they were contained. The sun seems to have been both the most ancient and most universal object of idolatrous worship, insomuch that perhaps there never was any nation of idolaters which did not pay some homage to this glorious luminary. He was worshipped by the ancient Britons with great devotion in many places, under the various names of Bel, Belinus, Belatucardus, Apollo, Granius, etc., all of which names in their language were expressive of the nature and properties of that visible fountain of light and heat. To this illustrious object of idolatrous worship, those famous circles of stones, of which there are not a few still remaining, seem to have been chiefly dedicated, where the Druids kept the sacred fire, the symbol of this divinity, and from whence, as being situated on eminences, they had a full view of the heavenly bodies. Like the ancient Jews and Persians, the Druids had a sacred, inextinguishable fire, which was preserved with the greatest care. At Kildare Island it was guarded from the most remote antiquity by an order of Druidesses, who were succeeded in later times by an order of Christian nuns. Higgins' Celtic Druids, page 283. As the moon appeared next in luster and utility to the sun, there can be no doubt that this radiant Queen of Heaven obtained a very early and very large share in the idolatrous veneration of mankind. The Gauls and Britons seem to have paid the same kind of worship to the moon as to the sun, and it hath been observed that the circular temples dedicated to these two luminaries were of the same construction and commonly contiguous. But a great number of the gods of Gaul and Britain, as well as of Greece and Rome, had been men, victorious princes, wise legislators, inventors of useful arts, etc. They worshipped also several female divinities or goddesses, as Andraste, who is supposed to have been the same with Venus or Diana, Minerva, Ceres, Proserpine, etc. Nay, into such an abyss of superstition and idolatry were they sunk, that according to Gildas, they had a greater number of gods than the Egyptians. And there was hardly a river, lake, mountain, or wood which was not supposed to have some divinities or genii residing in them. As it hath always been one end of religious worship to obtain certain favors from the objects of it, so prayers and supplication for these favors have always made a part of the religious worship of all nations, and in particular of that of the ancient Britons. When in danger they implored the protection of their gods, prayers were intermixed with their praises, accompanied their sacrifices, and attended every act of their religion. It seems indeed to have been the constant, invariable practice of all nations, the Jews not excepted, whenever they presented any offerings or sacrifices to their gods, to put up prayers to them to be propitious to the persons by whom and for whom the offerings or sacrifices were presented, and to grant them such particular favors as they desired. Offerings of various kinds constituted an important part of the religion of the ancient Britons. This was a mode of worship which the Druids very much encouraged, and their sacred places were crowded with those pious gifts. Mankind in all ages and in every country have betrayed a consciousness of guilt and dread of punishment from superior beings on that account. In consequence of this, they have employed various means to expiate the guilt of which they were conscious, and to escape the punishment of which they were afraid. The means which have been most universally employed by mankind for these ends were sacrifices of living creatures to their offended gods, which constituted a very essential part of the religion of the ancient Britons and of almost all other ancient nations. The animals which were sacrificed by them, as well as by other nations, were such as they used for their own food, which being very palatable and nourishing to themselves, they imagined would be no less agreeable to their gods. These victims were examined by the Druids with great care to see that they were the most perfect and beautiful in their several kinds, after which they were killed with various ceremonies by priests appointed for that purpose. On some occasions, the victims were consumed entirely by fire upon the altar, but more commonly they were divided into three parts, one of which was consumed upon the altar, another fell to the share of the priests who officiated, and on the third, the person who bought the sacrifice feasted with his friends. It had been well if our British ancestors had confined themselves to the sacrificing of oxen, sheep, goats, and other animals. But we have undoubted evidence that they proceeded to the most horrid lengths of cruelty in their superstition and offered human victims to their gods. It had unhappily become an article in the Druidical creed that nothing but the life of man could atone for the life of man. In consequence of this maxim, their altars streamed with human blood, and great numbers of wretched men fell a sacrifice to their barbarous superstition. They are said indeed to have preferred such as had been guilty of theft, robbery, and other crimes as most acceptable to their gods. But when there was a scarcity of criminals, they made no scruple to supply their place with innocent persons. These dreadful sacrifices were offered by the Druids for the public, at the eve of a dangerous war, or in the time of any national calamity, and for particular persons of high rank, when they were afflicted with any dangerous disease. By such acts of cruelty did the ancient Britons endeavor to avert the displeasure and gain the favor of their gods. It seems to have been one article in the creed of the ancient Britons and of all the other nations of antiquity that the gods whom they worshipped had the government of the world and the direction of future events in their hands, and that they were not unwilling upon proper application to discover these events to their pious worshippers. The gods, says Ammianus, either from the benignity of their own natures and their love to mankind, or because men have merited this favor from them, take a pleasure in discovering impending events by various indications. This belief gave rise to astrology, augury, magic, lots, and an infinite multitude of religious rites and ceremonies, by which deluded mortals hope to discover the counsels of heaven with regard to themselves and their undertakings. We learn from Pliny that the ancient Britons were greatly addicted to divination, and excelled so much in the practice of all its arts that they might have given a lesson to the Persians themselves. The British sovereigns of this period had not much authority either in the making or executing the laws, which are the principal acts of government in peaceful times. In that great relaxation of political union and civil government which prevailed in times of peace, their religion seems to have been the chief bond of union among the British tribes and nations, and the Druids, who were the ministers of that religion, appear to have professed the sole authority of making, explaining, and executing the laws, an authority to which the clergy of the Church of Rome long and eagerly aspired but never fully obtained. One great reason of the superior success of the Druids in their ambitious schemes was this: the laws among the ancient Britons and some other ancient nations were not considered as the decrees of their princes, but as the commands of their gods. And the Druids were supposed to bathe only persons to whom the gods communicated the knowledge of their commands, and consequently the only persons who could declare and explain them to the people. The violations of the laws were not considered as crimes against the prince or state, but as sins against heaven, for which the Druids, as the ministers of heaven, had alone the right of taking vengeance. All these important prerogatives of declaring, explaining, and executing the laws the Druids enjoyed and exercised in their full extent. All controversies, says Caesar, both public and private, are determined by the Druids. If any crime is committed or any murder perpetrated, if any disputes arise about the division of inheritances or the boundaries of estates, they alone have the right to pronounce sentence, and they are the only dispensers both of rewards and punishments. These ghostly judges had one engine which contributed much to procure submission to their decisions. This was the sentence of excommunication or interdict which they pronounced against particular persons or whole tribes when they refused to submit to their decrees. The interdicts of the Druids were no less dreadful than those of the popes, when their power was at its greatest height. The unhappy persons against whom they were fulminated were not only excluded from all sacrifices and religious rites, but they were held in universal detestation as impious and abominable. Their company was avoided as dangerous and contaminating. They were declared incapable of any trust or honor, put out of the protection of the laws, and exposed to injuries of every kind, a condition which must have rendered life intolerable and have brought the most refractory spirits to submission. Here doubtless is the source of the severity said to be enjoined upon the Masonic brotherhood towards backsliding or contumacious members, but the tolerant spirit of the age has no doubt left the threats held out in this case a mere dead letter. Masons expel their members for immoral conduct, and so do all other religious societies. They have a practice, however, in this regard that appears reprehensible, which is to publish in their registers the names of all those who have had the misfortune to be expelled from the order. This tends to fix an indelible stigma upon the character of an offending brother, prejudicial not only to himself, but to his family connections. The list containing names of delinquents should never be permitted to go beyond the walls of the lodge room. The first day of May was a great annual festival in honor of Belinus, or the sun. On this day, prodigious fires were kindled in all their sacred places, and on the tops of all their cairns, and many sacrifices were offered to that glorious luminary, which now began to shine upon them with great warmth and lustre. Of this festival there are still some vestiges remaining, both in Ireland and in the Highlands of Scotland, where the 1st of May is called Beltane, that is, the fire of Bel, or Belinus. I am inclined to think the author has mistaken the cause of these illuminations, and that they were originally the signals for a general purification mentioned by Pluche, in which everything subject to decay, for the benefit of health, was consumed by fire on the 1st of February in Egypt. They were called the Festival of the Firebrands, which name probably became changed in consequence of the origin and intention of the custom having been lost. Midsummer Day and the 1st of November were likewise annual festivals, the one to implore the friendly influences of heaven upon their fields, and the other to return thanks for the favorable seasons and the fruits of the earth, as well as to pay their yearly contributions to the ministers of their religion. Nay, it is even probable that all their gods and goddesses, their sacred groves, their hallowed hills, lakes and fountains, had their several anniversary festivals, so that the Druidical calendar was perhaps as much crowded with holidays as the Popish one is at present. On these festivals, after the appointed sacrifices and other acts of devotion were finished, the rest of the time was spent in feasting, singing, dancing, and all kinds of diversions. It was an article in the Druidical creed that it was unlawful to build temples to the gods, or to worship them within walls and under roofs. All their places of worship, therefore, were in the open air, and generally on eminences, from whence they had a full view of the heavenly bodies to whom much of their adoration was directed, but that they might not be too much incommoded by the winds and rains, distracted by the view of external objects, or disturbed by the intrusion of unhallowed feet. When they were instructing their disciples or performing their religious rites, they made choice of the deepest recesses of groves and woods for their sacred places. These groves were planted for that purpose in the most proper situations and with those trees in which they most delighted. The chief of these was the strong and spreading oak, for which tree the Druids had a very high and superstitious veneration. These sacred groves were watered by some consecrated fountain or river and surrounded by a ditch or mound to prevent the intrusion of improper persons. Where, says Masonry, did our ancient brethren meet before lodges were erected? Answer: upon holy ground, or the highest hill, or the lowest vale, or any other secret place, the better to guard against cowards and enemies. In the center of the grove was a circular area, enclosed with 1 or 2 rows of large stones set perpendicular in the earth, which constituted the temple, within which the altar stood, on which the sacrifices were offered. In some of their most magnificent temples, as particularly in that of Stonehenge, they had laid stones of prodigious weight on the tops of the standing pillars, which formed a kind of circle aloft in the air and added much to the grandeur of the whole. The British Druids were in the zenith of their power and glory at this period, enjoying an almost absolute authority over the minds and persons of their own countrymen, and being greatly admired and resorted to by strangers. But as the Romans gained ground in this island, the power of the Druids gradually declined, until it was quite destroyed. For that victorious people, contrary to their usual policy, discovered everywhere a very great animosity against the persons and religion of the Druids. They deprived the Druids of all authority in civil matters and showed them no mercy when they found them transgressing the laws or concerned in any revolt. Such of the Druids as did not think fit to submit to the Roman government and comply with the Roman rites fled into Caledonia, Ireland and the lesser British Isles, where they supported their authority for some time longer. Many of them retired into the Isle of Anglesey, which was a kind of little world of their own, and where the Archdruid of Britain is thought to have had his stated residence. But they did not long remain undisturbed in this retirement. For Suetonius Paulinus, who was governor of Britain under Nero, AD 61, observing that the Isle of Anglesey was the great seat of disaffection to the Roman government and the asylum of all who were forming plots against it, determined to subdue it. Having conducted his army to the island and defeated the Britons who attempted to defend it, though they were animated by the presence, the prayers and the exhortations of a great multitude of Druids and Druidesses, he made a very cruel use of his victory. Not content with cutting down their sacred groves, demolishing their temples, overturning their altars, he burned many of them in the fires which they had kindled for sacrificing the Roman prisoners if the Britons had gained the victory. So many of the Druids perished on this occasion, and the unfortunate revolt under Boadicea, queen of the Iceni, which happened soon after, that they were never able to make any considerable figure after this period. But though the dominion of the Druids in South Britain was destroyed at this time, many of their superstitious practices continued much longer. Nay, so deeply rooted were these principles in the minds of the people both of Gaul and Britain, that they not only baffled all the power of the Romans, but they even resisted the superior power and divine light of the gospel for a long time after they had embraced the Christian religion. This is the reason that we meet with so many edicts of emperors and canons of councils in the 6th, 7th and 8th centuries against the worship of the sun, moon, mountains, rivers, lakes and trees. This superstition continued even longer in Britain than in some other countries, having been revived first by the Saxons and afterwards by the Danes. It is a sufficient proof of this that so late as the 11th century in the reign of Canute, it was found necessary to make the following law against those heathenish superstitions. We strictly discharge and forbid all our subjects to worship the gods of the Gentiles, that is to say the sun, moon, fires, rivers, fountains, hills or trees, and wood of any kind. Extract from Dr. Lingard's History of England. To the veneration which the British Druids derived from their sacerdotal character must be added the respect which the reputation of knowledge never fails to extort from the ignorant. They professed to be the repositories of a sacred science far above the comprehension of the vulgar, and their schools were open to none but the sons of illustrious families. Such was their fame that the Druids of Gaul, to attain the perfection of the institute, did not disdain to study under their British brethren. They professed to be acquainted with the nature, the power, and the providence of the divinity, with the figure, size, formation, and final destruction of the earth, with the stars, their position and motions, and their supposed influence over human affairs. They practiced the art of divination and magic. 3 of their ancient astrologers were able, it is said, to foretell whatever should happen before the day of doom. To medicine also they had pretensions, but their knowledge was principally confined to the use of the mistletoe, vervain, savin and trefoil. And even the efficacy of these simples was attributed not to the nature of the plants, but to the influence of prayers and incantations. From the Edinburgh Encyclopedia. The garments of the Druids were remarkably long, and when employed in religious ceremonies they always wore a white surplice. They generally carried a wand in their hands, and wore a kind of ornament enchased in gold about their necks, called the Druid's egg. Their necks were likewise decorated with gold chains, and their hands and arms with bracelets. They wore their hair very short and their beards remarkably long. The Druids had one chief or archdruid in every nation who acted as high priest or pontifex maximus. They had absolute authority over the rest, and commanded, decreed, punished, etc., at pleasure. He was elected from amongst the most eminent Druids by a plurality of votes. They worshipped the Supreme Being under the name of Isus, or hens, and the symbol of the oak, and had no other temple than a wood or a grove, where all their religious rites were performed. Horus, says Pluche, assumed the casque and buckler when levies or recruits were intended. He was then called Harets, that is, the mighty, the formidable, violentes, Job 15:20. The Syrians softened this word and pronounced Hazis. We find the same word Hazis or Jesus used to signify the terrible in war, the Lord strong and mighty, the Lord mighty in battle. Psalm 24:8. Others pronounced it without aspiration and said Axis. Others with a very harsh and rough aspiration and pronounced warts. This figure of Horus in a warlike dress became the god of combats. He evidently is the Assisi of the inhabitants of Edessa, the Jesus of the Gauls, the Axis of the Greeks, the warts or Mars of the Sabines and Latins. Nor was any person admitted to enter that sacred recess unless he carried with him a chain, in token of his absolute dependence on the deity. The consecrated groves in which they performed their religious rites were fenced round with stones to prevent any persons entering except through the passages left open for that purpose, and which were guarded by some inferior Druids to prevent any stranger from intruding into their mysteries. These groves were of different forms, some quite circular, others oblong and more or less capacious, as the votaries in the districts to which they belonged were more or less numerous. In the chain carried by the ancient Britons in the performance of their religious rites is to be seen the archetype of the cable tow or tow rope, worn about the neck of the aspirant to Masonic secrets, which is the subject of much ridicule among the uninitiated profane, and indeed the fraternity themselves do not seem to be aware of its true import. They are not conscious that this humble badge is testimony of their belief in God, their dependence on Him, and their solemn obligations to devote themselves to His will and service. The candidate for Masonic instruction should be looked upon as an untutored, wild man of the woods, a mere child of nature, unregenerated and destitute of any knowledge of the true God, as well as the conveniences and comforts of civilized life. For this reason he is exhibited blindfolded, neither naked nor clothed, but about halfway between both. Here also may be seen the type of the Masonic tiler, an inferior officer with a drawn sword to guard the lodge from the impertinent intrusion of cowans, or rather cowans and eavesdroppers. It will not be pretended that a sword is needed in this case. It is a mere ensign of office in conformity to the Druidical custom. The following extracts from Hume's History of England will account for the slow introduction of Christianity among the ancient Britons. The most memorable event which distinguished the reign of this great Prince Ethelbert was the introduction of the Christian religion among the English Saxons. The superstition of the Germans, particularly that of the Saxons, was of the grossest and most barbarous kind, and being founded on traditionary tales received from their ancestors, not reduced to any system, nor supported by political institutions like that of the Druids, it seems to have made little impression on its votaries, and to have easily resigned its place to the new doctrine promulgated to them. On the contrary, the constant hostilities which the Saxons maintained against the Britons would naturally indispose them for receiving the Christian faith, when preached to them by such inveterate enemies. The Saxons, though they'd been long settled in the island, seem not as yet, in the early part of the 9th century, to have been much improved beyond their German ancestors, either in art, civility, knowledge, humanity, justice, or obedience to the laws. Even Christianity, though it opened the way to connections between them and the more polished states of Europe, had not hitherto been very effectual in banishing their ignorance or softening their barbarous manners. As they received that doctrine through the corrupted channels of Rome, it carried along with it a great mixture of credulity and superstition, equally destructive to the understanding and to morals. The reverence towards saints and relics seems to have almost supplanted the adoration of the Supreme Being. Monastic observances were esteemed more meritorious than the active virtues. The knowledge of natural causes was neglected from the universal belief of miraculous interposition and judgments. Bounty to the Church atoned for every violence against society, and the remorse for cruelty, murder, treachery, assassination, and the more robust vices were appeased not by amendment of life, but by penances, civility to the monks, and an abject and illiberal devotion. The ecclesiastics in those days of ignorance, in the middle of the 9th century, made rapid advances in the acquisition of power and grandeur and in inculcating the most absurd and most interested doctrines. Not content with the donations of land made them by the Saxon princes and nobles, they had cast a wishful eye on a vast revenue which they claimed as belonging to them by a sacred and indefeasible title. However little versed in the scriptures, they had been able to discover that under the Jewish law, a tenth of all the produce of land was conferred on the priesthood, and, forgetting what they themselves taught, that the moral part only was obligatory on Christians, they insisted that this donation conveyed a perpetual property, inherent by divine right, in those who officiated at the altar. During some centuries, the whole scope of sermons and homilies was directed to this purpose, and one would have imagined, from the general tenor of these discourses, that all the practical parts of Christianity were comprised in the exact and faithful payment of the tithes to the clergy. Encouraged by their success in inculcating these doctrines, they ventured farther than they were warranted, even by the Levitical law, and pretended to draw the tenth of all industry, merchandise, wages of laborers, and pay of soldiers. Nay, some canonists went so far as to affirm that the clergy were entitled to the tithe of the profits made by courtesans in the exercise of their profession. Slavery in England. As slaves are not admitted into the society of Freemasons, it may be interesting to some of my readers, unacquainted with the fact, to know the vast extent of the evils of slavery in England at the time when this institution is supposed to have been established, and the great proportion of the inhabitants, particularly of the mechanical and laboring classes, that were consequently excluded from a participation in its charitable and benevolent purposes. I therefore give the following extract from Dr. Henry's History of the Different Ranks of People in Britain, from the arrival of the Saxons, AD 449, to the landing of William, Duke of Normandy, 1066. The lowest order of people among the Anglo-Saxons and the other nations of Britain in this period were slaves, who, with their wives and children, were the property of their masters. Besides those who were native slaves or slaves by birth, others frequently fell into this wretched state by various means, as by an ill run at play, by the fate of war, or by forfeiting their freedom by their crimes, or even by contracting debts which they were not able to pay. These unhappy people, who were very numerous, formed an article both of internal and foreign trade. Only if the slave was a Christian, he was not to be sold to a Jew or a pagan, or if he belonged to the same nation with his master, he was not to be sold beyond the sea. Slaves were, however, of various kinds among the Anglo-Saxons, employed in various works, and were not all in an equal state of thraldom. Some of them were called villani, or villains, because they dwelt at the villages belonging to their masters, and performed the servile labors of cultivating their lands, to which they were annexed, and transferred with these lands from one owner to another. Others were domestic slaves and performed various offices about the houses and families of their masters. Some of these domestic slaves of the king and the nobility were taught the mechanic arts, which they practiced for the benefit of their owners. And the greatest number of the mechanics of those times seem to have been in a state of servitude. Slaves were not supposed to have any family or relations who sustained any loss by their death. And therefore, when one of them was killed by his master, no mulct was paid, because the master was supposed to be the only loser. When slain by another, his price or manbote was paid to his master. In a word, slaves of the lowest order were considered merely as animals of burden and parts of their owner's living stock. In the laws of Wales, it is expressly said that a master hath the same right to his slaves as to his cattle. The horrors of this cruel servitude were gradually mitigated, and many of those unhappy wretches were raised from this abject state to the privileges of humanity. The introduction of Christianity contributed not a little, both to alleviate the weight of servitude and diminish the number of slaves. By the canons of the Church, which were in those times incorporated with the laws of the land, and of the same authority, Christians were commanded to allow their slaves certain portions of time to work for their own benefit, by which they acquired property. The bishops had authority to regulate the quantity of work to be done by slaves and to take care that no man used his slave harshly, but as a fellow Christian. The bishops and clergy recommended the manumission of slaves as a most charitable and meritorious action. And in order to set the example, they procured a law to be made that all English slaves of every bishop should be set at liberty at his death, and that every other bishop and abbot in the kingdom should set 3 slaves at liberty. But after all these mitigations of the severities of slavery and diminutions of the number of slaves, the yoke of servitude was still very heavy, and the greatest part of the laborers, mechanics, and common people groaned under that yoke at the conclusion of this period. The next class or rank of people in Britain in this period was composed of those who were called freemasons, who had been slaves but had either purchased or by some other means obtained their liberty. Though these were in reality free men, they were not considered as of the same rank and dignity with those who had been born free, but were still in a more ignoble and dependent condition, either on their former masters or on some new patrons. This custom, the Anglo-Saxons seem to have derived from their ancestors in Germany, among whom those who had been made free did not differ much in point of dignity or importance in the state from those who continued in servitude. This distinction between those who had been made free and those who enjoy freedom by descent from a long race of freemen still prevails in many parts of Germany, and particularly in the original seats of the Anglo-Saxons. Many of the inhabitants of towns and cities in England in this period seem to have been of this class of men who were in a kind of middle state between slaves and freemen. The third class, or rank of people in Britain in the period we are now considering, consisted of those who were completely free and descended from a long race of freemen. This numerous and respectable body of men, who were called sea-orls, constituted a middle class between the laborers and mechanics, who were generally slaves or descended from slaves on the one hand, and the nobility on the other. They might go where they pleased and pursue any way of life that was most agreeable to their humor. In the time of the Anglo-Saxon rule, says Dr. Lingard, not less than 2/3 of the population of Britain existed in a state of slavery, and the sale and purchase of slaves publicly prevailed during the whole of this period. These unhappy men were sold like cattle in the market. The Northumbrians, like the savages of Africa, are said to have carried off not only their own countrymen, but even their friends and relatives, and to have sold them as slaves in the ports of the continent. The men of Bristol were the last to abandon this nefarious traffic. Their agents traveled into every part of the country. They were instructed to give the highest price for females in a state of pregnancy, and the slave ships regularly sailed from that port to Ireland, where they were secure of a ready and profitable market. Thank you for watching, and please don't forget to share, like, subscribe, and comment. And if you can, please consider donating to Wars of the Roses. Links to PayPal and Patreon are in the description. Thank you so very much.